This podcast is brought to you by the Albany Public Library main branch and the generosity of listeners like you. What is a podcast? God, Daddy, these people talk as much as you do. Razib Khan's Unsupervised Learning.
Thanks for listening to the ungated version of the Unsupervised Learning podcast. If you want to read some essays on some of these topics, please check out razib.substack.com. Again, that's razib.substack.com. Thank you.
All right, so I'm here today on this episode of Unsupervised Learning. I don't ever forget that I'm on an episode of Unsupervised Learning, I think. And I think you guys know where you are, but it's one of those things we do, right? Pretending like it was a radio show and someone could just be tuning in at the beginning of the episode. It's one of those weird tics or holdovers we have from the past ages. And I don't know when people will just, at some point people will stop doing it because not all podcasts do that. Some podcasts just like start as if you know who they are. But a lot of the time you do know who they are, like if you're subscribing. But if you're a millennial and you're coming in through some YouTube content feed, you might not know who we are at all, right? And so it's kind of useful. My name is Razib Khan. You can look me up on the internet. I'm not going to introduce myself any more fully than that because my regular listeners know who I am. And if you're coming in through YouTube and you're a mindless Zoomer, you can go to Wikipedia. But I am here with my friend, Dr. Kevin Klatt. And Kevin, we decided that you would introduce yourself because it could be a little bit long, and I might stumble on it. So I'll just let you do the honors.
Sure, happy to be here. My name is Kevin Klatt. I am a research scientist in the Department of Nutritional Sciences and Toxicology at UC Berkeley. I did my PhD in molecular metabolism type research, and I'm also a registered dietitian. Do some work in controlled feeding studies and interventions in human nutrition. And I am an associate editor at the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. So lots of nutrition things, a little bit basic science, a little bit of human nutrition work.
Yeah, in academia, in lieu of a big fat salary, they give you a lot of titles for a lot of the little things that you do. And that's all that prestige and all that influence you have out there, right? Also, you have
wish I could trade it.
Yeah. Anyone listening out there, I'll put Kevin's contact in the show notes. If you, actually, I will say, Kevin, I've known you for literally a decade now. And, I always do enjoy talking with you because you have a breadth of I don't know, just like in terms of domain specialties. You're not just like a nutritional epidemiologist, these molecular mechanisms, and, you've done some science communication, quote unquote. So, it's nice talking to you because you have a lot of touch points out there that are relevant. I think that's why we want to start out. You have a Substack, Casey Klatt's Substack. No one said you were a marketer. So, it is what it is. The link will be out there.
Drag me, please. Please send in some suggestions for
your name. Your name, if you just put Kevin Klatt Substack, that's boring and generic. But that would juice up your name's page rank out there. So that's a suggestion that I'm going to put right there. But other people can have other suggestions. But the MAHA commission launches. MAHA, Make America Healthy Again. As we're recording, RFK has been, I think he's been confirmed, as head of HHS, which is, I'm not sure if it's the most money, but it's one of the bigger departments, Health and Human Services out there. All the science and health funding, a lot of the nutrition stuff. And so this is a big deal. Give the listener out there a précis of your post.
Yeah, no, the MAHA movement has been kind of growing for quite a while now. And I think, folks didn't take it super seriously at first, but there's a level of enthusiasm, somewhat bipartisan, obviously a little bit more on the right, given the administration. But just, I think folks want to change the food system. And we've seen a lot of talk about it, but I think this executive order is really starting to put together an actual commission that plans to bring together a bunch of hopefully change makers to do something about the food system. Within it, I guess I have both good faith earnest, maybe a little naive takes on what the executive order is trying to do. And then also, I think it doesn't take much reading between the lines to see that some of the hyperbole and some of the more scary things on vaccine sentiments are shining through in the executive order as well. But the executive order, I think one of the things that people are going to find refreshing about it is that there hasn't been a lot in the past 10, 20 years that you feel. I mean, there's been Surgeon General's calls, and Michelle Obama tried to do stuff on nutrition that got really hamstrung through a lot of political BS. But it's a first executive order, I think, in a while where you really see people calling out nutrition, obesity, and related chronic diseases, and arguing that we need to really do something about it to take it seriously. A lot of the things that they actually call out are like really highlighting elusive chemicals without naming it, and food additives. And I think they sort of undersell the degree of a problem that like tackling obesity, nutrition, and chronic disease would actually entail within the country. And there's some concerning things in there around really highlights also the prevalence of autism between 1980 and now, which is sort of a typical dog whistle in anti-vaccine spaces, as though there's like something that changed in the past 40 years in the environment that's driving autism, and not like without adequate context around physicians being aware of it, diagnostic criteria changing. So that, I mean, folks can go read the executive order. We could belabor this for a while, but I think my post kind of calls out the actual executive order just says like, food additives and chemicals causing inflammation. We need to really address this. And I think inflammation might be one of the most abused and underdefined words used, but we don't really set any diet or nutrition policy based off of its impact on inflammation. We don't really know if inflammation is mediating anything. We think inflammation plays a role in chronic diseases, but how diet influences inflammation, whether diet impacts actual chronic disease risk through inflammation, is a big question. It's an area where we have very little data. The executive order doesn't really go into things where we have much more data, like controlling blood cholesterol, controlling blood pressure, blood glucose, weight loss. Very scant, if any, mention of that sort of stuff. And that's an area where we have more data. Some of it is more positive. Some of it really presents the challenges. Like you look at the most recent United States Preventive Services Task Force, the USPSTF recommendations around interventions for weight loss, and the data for behavioral interventions, so that including nutrition and physical activity to actually reduce BMI in kids, it's really pitiful effects. And I think it's a part of my post is really just arguing we have systematically underinvested in research in nutrition generally. And I've been on this beat for quite a while now, that we have nothing, a lot of the pharmaceutical industry funds itself on the backs of NIH, like basic discovery research, but there's no pharma equivalent that funds nutrition research. You have a little bit of effort from commodity boards that make individual agricultural products. You have a little bit from the USDA. You can pull a little bit of foundation money together, but it makes the field of nutrition look so unserious relative to the pharmaceutical industry because we don't have the cash to do it, and the government hasn't really funded it. And when it comes to specifically children's nutrition, which this executive order talks about a lot, our data is just pathetic. We have a few areas that have been studied, like calcium and bone mineral density, a bit more rigorously, but there needs to be a massive investment. And I think part of my, hopeful, good faith, maybe naive push for the administration is to make up for these lost efforts of actually understanding what works, what are kids' nutrient needs, whether the things that we think happen in adults actually apply to kids, which is a big question. Like I highlight in the post, in 2019, the National Academies of Sciences, they reviewed all the data on sodium and blood pressure and cardiovascular disease risk. And there's like reasonable data in adults. It's one of the areas we have a lot more evidence. And they just couldn't confidently come to much of a conclusion based on all the systematic reviews and meta-analyses they did for kids. And they sort of just have to guess at like a value, a number about whether kids, how much kids should sodium sort of has, or how much sodium should kids have as their max. Because we just don't have strong data in this area. Like, so that to me is a huge indictment and kind of pathetic, like that we can't even confidently say whether eating more sodium and what level of sodium starts to increase blood pressure in kids. it's not great. So I think, back in 2000, there was a big push for funding what was called a national children's study, just sort of acknowledging that the United States has not systematically invested in understanding how the environment affects kids' development. I think, with kids, it's not just about chronic disease risk, but it's also about like how's their cognitive development, how's brain development, bone development, and the environment influences a lot of those things. And there was an acknowledged need for like a large national children's study that just collected everything in your environmental exposure, assess cognitive development, assess disease risk. And the National Children's Study, I can send you a link to it. Yeah, there's a lot of some news coverage of it. It sort of just never really got off the grounds, ran into a lot of logistical issues, wasn't really managed well, piloted. And you can read all about it. And I'm sure there's more behind the scenes than I even know because this predates my time in modern science. But it never succeeded in its goal of us having a large national cohort that studied children and all of their environmental exposures and how it influences development. And so we, to this day, still lack so much data. And so the executive order says a lot about, it waxes poetic about like, we need to have evidence-based interventions and all these things. And I'm just kind of like, what evidence? Like, we have not funded it. And I think that could be a legacy of MAHA if they want to be really taken seriously. Not that you can't do anything, but fixing the huge research gaps on not only nutrition, but environmental chemicals and all these sorts of things. We really lack the data.
Yeah, so the the fact that you said that it's a big indictment on where we are right now, because I think we have the technology in areas like say marketing, advertisement, to these micro targeting on people because we're tracking them day to day so much in terms of what they're purchasing, what they're doing. So it's not like we don't have technology like Apple Watches, MyFitnessPal, all these different things. We can do things much more unobtrusive anyway. We know what people are purchasing, and we could like do meal kit. We could like send meal kits. I don't know. There could be an HHS like funded meal kit where you give free meals to people. They would do it, roughly. And we could figure something out. But to my knowledge, we're not doing that. I know that you have talked to me about issues with the data. It's like, I think you've talked to me about this for literally 10 years. I think we talked about this for 10 years. And we're still in the same position that we were, right? What do you think, what do you think the hang up is? Do you think it's the bureaucracy? Do you think it's like regulations? Do you think it's maybe like IRB fears? Do you just think that, well, okay, so part of it is like, let's just acknowledge that the whole MAHA movement and where the Trump movement and the MAGA movement is radically different from where the right and the Republican Party were when I first started talking to you, say 2015.
Yeah. Yeah. 2015, we were watching like Michelle Obama try and change school lunch and, reduce sodium and these sorts of things. And she was being labeled by the food police or whatever. And
yeah.
So we're at
well, we were still in the wake of big gulp conservatism.
Yes, absolutely.
Which, for those of you who are a little younger or don't follow politics or not American, in 2008, there was like a big brouhaha where, Vice President Sarah Palin, who herself was a relatively thin, fit American of early middle age then. I think she was actually younger than I am now, but, but she was defending the idea of eating kind of crappy food, fast food, the kind of crap that you get at 7-Elevens while, Obama and his wife were promoting a healthier lifestyle. And, in that period around Obamacare and its passage, healthier lifestyle was extremely Democratic coded. Republicans were defending kind of being, eating fast food and being fat. I don't know how else to say it. I think that is kind of what the brand was, right?
Yeah, I think it was very much a libertarian, like you should have, it's a personal responsibility to have your own good nutrition and, fight obesity and these sorts of things. And so very much some pretty industry friendly, free access to foods. And you should be able to buy 64 ounces of sugar sweetened beverage if you want. And the left was a bit more, I think, pro-regulatory around that space.
Yeah. And it was, Bloomberg was there. The Bloomberg was like soda tax, all these things. I mean, some of us remember. We were there.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of people on the left remember, and that's part of the MAHA movement is it's kind of a shock to people. And I think we've seen a political realignment in many ways that you've talked about on the podcast before. And so things are shifting, and even in the sort of dietitian community, there's a lot of people who are like, I would say dietitians are politically mixed, but most of the time on food issues, you end up being a bit more on the left or progressive side of things. And you have a lot more people saying, no, we need to align with these people. And then you have other, these advocates, and then you have other folks being like, but like, we might make progress on food, but are we going to roll back vaccines? And, there's been a lot of false dichotomies around that. We've been focusing so much on vaccines and immunological health and COVID and masking, and we're not focusing enough on obesity and chronic disease. And I don't think you have to pick between one or the other. And it's clear that we've had historical failings on really like making much progress on obesity. I mean, the CDC numbers that came out most recently are that we're at like 70% overweight and obese in the country within adult populations. And so we're not doing well on that front. And I think it's, we probably will talk about Ozempic and GLP-1 receptor type stuff, where pharma has really seen this as an area that we can make a lot of progress within. And the nutrition world, again, doesn't have the funding, doesn't have the research that pharma has. And what little data there is out there is not all that promising that like really intensive lifestyle interventions move the needle all that much, which is a big concern for anybody. I think the MAHA movement and advocates of it really need to sit with is that the data that we do have isn't all that promising. And I think we need a massive, reinvigoration and flow of cash into the research environment to fund, all sorts of pilot trials, all sorts of policies, whatever you want to call it, or whatever you can think of, just to see if we can get something that works. Because it's been like, people have been stringing along really small pots of money to do 100-person studies that are really, working off of limited funds. And so they're doing a little bit of a healthy eating intervention, a little bit of like a physical activity intervention, a lot of education. And that we just know that like giving people information doesn't necessarily change behavior. There's been really landmark large studies like the Look Ahead trial that you can find. This is more in adults than in kids, and MAHA has a big focus on kids, and there's really not much data there. But the Look Ahead trial like had a super intensive lifestyle interventions with like one-on-one counseling, weekly meetings after the first 6 months or so, giving people access to physical activity equipment, tons of health education stuff, very individualized to the person. So nothing that even comes close to the way that America addresses lifestyle interventions. If you want to get insurance coverage to see a dietitian even, it's pretty tough. So these interventions are stacking the deck, and they see like, 5 to 10% weight loss within the first year, but then the intervention typically doesn't keep up. It's not all that aggressive, and they pull out, and you see like, recidivism basically with the weight gain coming back. And they haven't, met their primary end. We see the benefits of weight gain on a number of health outcomes. Look Ahead was quite disappointing for being this massive trial with this massive intensive lifestyle intervention that didn't meet its primary endpoint of lowering cardiovascular events. And the data has been p-hacked to death, and looking at, well, the people who lost at least 10% of their body weight see a reduction in risk and all. And it's not that I think it says, like lifestyle interventions are bad, but it really shows us that you need to invest insanely in individualized empowerment, changing the food environment, lowering the bar, I guess I should say, to living a healthier lifestyle for folks. And even then, it's not like you quote unquote cure obesity. You get modest weight loss out of that. So I think if we sit and digest the level of the problem that we're facing here, and we look at the type of data that we have and compare that to things like pharmaceutical interventions that are coming down the pipeline, MAHA has a huge barrier to overcome. And I don't want to be nihilistic about that. I just think it's like, okay, we're watching Doge kind of like deconstruct the NIH biomedical research infrastructure currently. And I'm like, oh, the opposite needs to be happening if we really want to make, realize and actualize what MAHA says it wants to. Removing some food dyes is not going to cure all.
Yeah, I want to like. So I was in DC during inauguration week, basically. Went to some of the balls, some of the events, and I met some people that went to RFK's ball. I didn't go myself, but I had some friends that went, and I had people. There were people. There was a after ball party, and some people showed up. I will tell you that the MAHA people are demographically visible. I will describe them as usually a little older in their 40s and 50s. have a little bit of face work, Hollywood-ish trim. So yeah, they look like the kind of type of person you would see around the age of 50 in LA. So they're
I was gonna say
demographically different.
they're Erewhon shoppers, right? Like,
So it's a different demographic. Another thing though that's interesting, you were talking about how early on, I want to mention this because it's just very funny to me. If you go to SNL in the archives, there's a sketch called The Bubble, which is after Trump won in 2016. And The Bubble was basically a place where everyone is a Democrat. And they agree that Hillary should have won. And it's like, it makes you feel good about yourself. And there's all things like, used bookstores. And they have a white woman reading Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me or something. And then they also say that they have farmers markets and raw milk. And I was like, that has a different valence now, 8 years now. Like in 2016, that was totally left coded where it could be put in the Bubble commercial. And now the MAHA movement has transformed raw milk to becoming more of a right-leaning thing, I think.
yeah, I mean, raw milk it's kind of hilarious. Like you have a foundation called the Weston A. Price Foundation that has been, I guess, to be fair, like it feels like it was left coded and now it's right coded, but it was also right coded before it was left coded as a libertarian thing. So it was like like individual rights to purchase raw milk and more of like a libertarian vibe thing. So we've really hit all I think only the Green Party needs to step in and become raw milk advocates, and then we'll complete the cycle for all of the political parties advocating for raw milk. Which is like, it's kind of wild because it's one of the areas where it's considered one of the larger public health successes. Everything from pasteurization to putting fluoride in water and things, and these are all getting questioned alongside vaccines as folks not only like question their effect size, but they like say, actually, no, the opposite is better, which is kind of
well there's also raw water.
Yeah, water is notoriously not a vector for any disease, so we want to drink it raw.
Yeah, some of this stuff, isn't it? You said it was, you pointed out like the cycles, but going back, like talking about, say, vaccination. I haven't done deep research on this. My understanding is the anti-vax movement has been, anti-vax is a little bit of pejorative. So let me just say the vaccination skeptical movement, just to be more objective. But the vaccine skeptical people, and again, like I'm gonna have some listeners flip out, so I'm just gonna like do a preface here. I am well aware that a minority of people have a negative reaction to vaccines. My best friend, I've told the story before. My best friend from middle school died of some sort of inflammatory response to the anthrax vaccine during induction into the Marines. So it happened over a 2-hour period, and his father was basically told, like, look, we do this to so many people every year. There's like a small number of people that have this negative reaction, and your son was one of them, and we can't predict, right? So obviously it's the military. They're not going to want people advertise this, but it happens. So I get it. But on the whole, vaccination has been like a really, really straightforward, just reducing mortality. Like you can see it in the data, and you can see when there's like vaccine skepticism. And like not all vaccine rollouts have been great. There have been some problems in some cases. So again, that's part of the issue. You can see it in the data that people get measles and all these other things that just like come back up, and then like people are like, oh, okay, so it's one of those things where once you haven't had to confront certain diseases at the endemic level for a while, you start to see all the bad sides of vaccination. There are some issues with it, and so then people experiment, and then all of a sudden they pull back. I mean, that's what I've read has happened in the past. Like, what do you know about it, Kevin?
Yeah, I guess I very much stick to my lane and my expertise on nutrition, and I know a bit about vaccines, but I don't want to speak to it too much. There's folks like Paul Offit and whatnot at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia who do tons of great science communication on that. So I would definitely encourage folks to kind of look that up. And there's a lot of good information out there. People taking seriously what the concerns are, but trying to contextualize them within the broader public health scheme. And I think you only need to look right now as we're talking. There's a big measles outbreak in Texas. 13 of the 48 confirmed cases are already kids who are hospitalized now. And so it's a shame that we have to relearn history. It's hard to go back in time and imagine like with raw milk, like it was a major vector for tuberculosis back in the early 1900s. And so like, I don't think you can talk to anybody now who's like, in their 20s or 30s or 40s and hasn't really seen the harms of raw milk, regularly drinks it with a strong immune system and doesn't really think like, oh, what's the big problem? Like these things are not, it's hard to realize how much of an issue they were when there's not like sort of an endemic widespread consumption of them where you actually see that, okay, if only 0.1% of people have a bad reaction to raw milk or whatever, it's like, well, when millions of people are doing that, that's like thousands and tens and hundreds of thousands of cases of food poisoning from it and some percentage of deaths from that. So it's a huge concern, I think, for public health that there's like a saying that the best public health is silent public health. It's just like happening in the background. And I think that's nowadays something that people are questioning the utility of because they haven't seen its actual benefits. That's to be honest, I think we have to acknowledge it's a huge area where if you want to become in the modern influencer economy and people making money off of being media personalities, like just being a contrarian goes a super long way. Sort of whether in nutrition, we've had this for decades, whether it's low carb or seed oils or sodium's actually really good for you. And I mean, we've seen it over and over and over and over again where people make platforms, diet books, make a ton of money off of taking theoretical risks and turning them into, or theoretical hazards and turning them into massive risks that scare people out of doing things. And also taking theoretical benefits of like supplements and all these sorts of things that they turn into magical cures. And that goes a long way in the modern wellness environment. So I think we're only in for more of that within MAHA. As a researcher, I'm like, okay, like we do the best we can with the data we have, particularly on the like people who sell, there's like a mass vitamin D deficiency that's causing all of our diseases and these sort of hyperboles that it's sad to me that we actually don't even have the research funding to do the trials that would answer that question all that definitively. So there's a huge market place for supplements and health foods and all these things, and just trickles for funding to actually study this kind of stuff.
Yeah. You said something about p hacking earlier yesterday, and so obviously with MAHA and what's going on at HHS, like we will see. I have I don't know RFK at all. I have friends who have influence or who have positions in HHF. Not everyone is kind of woo woo type person. I will tell you that. There's gonna be some interesting things that happen, but we're recording in early times. We don't really know what it's gonna look like with the new personnel that are still coming in. It's going to take some time, probably the next 6 months, and then we can have a discussion about that. You said something about p hacking though earlier. For the listener out there who, I think most of you guys should know about what p hacking is, but not all of you listen to all the podcasts. Some of them have gone into it pretty deeply, but it's basically like you're looking to get like to a certain level of statistical significance. That's a publishable unit, and I don't know, through various means, conscious or unconscious, you kind of manipulate the experimental setup so it gets to statistical significance. And once you get to that, boom, it's published. Whereas the other stuff that's just above statistical significance, below. Well, no, it's above 0.05. That's how I'm going to say it. Those don't get published, and so you see this trend in the peer reviewed literature. Where there's a lot of stuff that's like right around 0.05, like right below it. And then you also see the effect size of a lot of the publications that are around 0.05 are way bigger than the ones that are much more statistically significant, which is indicative that whatever initial result there was is kind of random. Okay, so we have this whole issue with the replication crisis. P hacking is part of it. There's other things like fraud and whatever. We don't need to get into all the details. Nutrition has had these problems for a while because nutrition is, on the whole, an observational science. There have been some attempts to do like really controlled experiments, like Gary Taubes, I think the guy who hates sugar, tried to do it, and that collapsed in some sort of acrimony. So it was they were going to control the input, and there's gonna be people that lived in like control.
New Sci initiative. Yeah, they were trying to ask whether carbohydrates are uniquely fattening.
Yeah, and so there's all this stuff going on. Where are we at in 2025? Because, replication crisis most famously hit social psychology, but it's been everywhere. I think it's finally starting to cracks are starting to show in medical science, which is disastrous and horrible because there's so much money and so much, public policy in that. I think that's why it actually did not break at the same time as social psychology, which is more just fun studies that you can talk about at parties. When it comes to public health, though, it's a big deal. And so, if there has been a crisis, then the heads are, careers are going to end. Like there's going to be a big thing coming out in the future. So what are you seeing right now?
Yeah, I think nutrition has always been sort of a subject of criticisms around rigor. That can be due to many other things besides just like non-reproducible data. I guess for the listener, it might help to just think about kind of the study designs that we have in nutrition. I do some of the more controlled things that you're talking about, like controlled feeding studies where you provide all of the food. And you can imagine if you're going to control every morsel of food that someone gets, particularly if they're in like a domiciled inpatient type setting where they're living in your facility or whatever, you can only do that for a few weeks at a time. And so you have tons of control over the diet, but you have really short-term follow-up. And so you've got to extrapolate whatever you can measure, like a biomarker in the blood or some self-reported measure of, feeling, quality of life or mental health, et cetera. You got to extrapolate that out and hope that what you saw in a 4-week time frame also happens in a 2-year time frame. We also have controlled trials where you sort of just educate people on a diet. Those are quite common where you have a dietitian talk with all the participants, randomized. One group gets either nothing or some dietary education to go one way, and the other group gets education to eat a different diet. And so you don't have control over the diets. You don't really know what they ate other than by asking them what they ate. And you can do typically longer term trials that way. But at the end of the day, it's kind of sometimes hard to interpret that data, particularly when they come in null, because it's like, well, did they actually follow the diet? How long did that happen? And then you have like observational epidemiological studies where you either give people questionnaires or dietary recalls. So sort of a checklist saying, I eat this food group this frequently, or you actually probe them about their diet. It's usually more of the former in large cohort studies. And then in the best version of these things, they give those questionnaires multiple times over a several year period and then have like long-term follow-up where you can actually follow to see whether somebody had a disease endpoint. In your smaller term trials, you can measure like blood cholesterol, but that is only a surrogate risk factor for cardiovascular disease. In these large cohort studies, you can actually measure whether somebody has like a heart attack or a stroke, but you don't have control over their diet. It's non-random. We know diet is correlated with lots of other things. Researchers try and adjust for all of that. But you not only have issues with the people's ability to remember their diet, but and accurately report it and not have it be biased, but you have that diet is correlated with so many other factors that we're not always good at measuring and adjusting for. So I think from a rigor standpoint, the field of medicine is really good with double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials where you give a statin or you give a placebo and you follow people up. That's easy to adhere to for the most part. And you follow people up for 5 years and you measure, does this reduce heart attacks? And doing the version of that study in nutrition, we very rarely get to do those very rigorous designs where we can causally attribute that our dietary intervention reduced this disease endpoint. That's part of why one of the more recent ones in history was the PREDIMED trial of the Mediterranean diet, where that like randomized individuals to a Mediterranean style diet. Granted, it was already, this could be a whole podcast on its own, but it was already taking place in Spain and the Mediterranean. So even the control group is eating a much more Mediterranean diet than Americans are. But they largely gave them a bunch of extra virgin olive oil or nuts and seeds like walnuts and almonds, and saw reductions in cardiovascular events there. So we have some level of confidence that the things that we're saying in nutrition are probably good for you, but you have to string along multiple lines of evidence. And for anybody who wants to sow doubt, there's always limitations in any single line of this evidence, particularly the more fine-tuned you get, debating about specific quantities of a specific nutrient, whether they're good or bad. You can run interference to existing guidelines because of the inherent limitations in nutrition. And you can definitely take the sort of promise that is unrealized in many nutrition questions and spin that into a whole conspiracy of everyone is secretly magnesium deficient and you all need to buy my magnesium and this is the truth that the government's hiding from you. I would say like do we have a reproducibility crisis so much in nutrition? It's hard to say, in large part because we only get like occasionally one of these really large trials, and so you don't even get a chance to reproduce things. There are, I think, phenomena like, a lot of the reproducibility crisis occurred with Brian Wansink, who I would not call a nutrition scientist. He's more of an economist, but he did many pretty cutesy food trials, like having people eat from a bowl of soup and secretly having this bowl of soup be refilled from the bottom, and showing that people eat more when it's secretly being refilled because we're not good in an acute eating occasion at sort of self-regulating intake, and we eat perceived off of volume and other social cues and whatnot. I think the field in that sort of more psychology of eating behavior is an area where we've had some reproducibility issues, and we're not 100% sure what is real or not real. But in general, I would say, like, for listeners, we haven't funded nutrition seriously enough in like large randomized controlled trials and have enough of them to really start to say a ton about reproducibility. You can look at reproducibility across cohort studies done in different countries and things like that, but if you don't reproduce findings, like, it's not clear that it was due to some methodological or scandalous thing, but just the differences in diets that occur across nations. So yeah, I would, rigor is definitely like a concern. The lack of big randomized controlled trials that we can undertake, and then again, there are huge, I think, constraints on doing those very well that you can see in the history of nutrition when they've been attempted. But we've also been surviving off of pennies relative to what basic sciences and pharmaceutical sciences are working with. So if we could get a huge infusion of research funding, cash flow to really start to do things seriously, I think we could have a much more rigorous science.
Yeah, I mean, shout out to RFK. So I guess I think part of what you're saying here is, you're talking about those double-blind, randomized. You give someone a statin. It's like causal density issues. You have like a single cause here, a single drug that you're giving. It's so easy to track. When you're talking about nutrition, I mean, you got like all the different types of food. People are drinking things. Also, obviously, if you're like doing weight as an output, activity matters. So there's all these variables coming in.
Yeah, foods vary in their nutritional composition. Even crops vary in we have averages and nutrient composition databases, but like your blueberries and my blueberries don't have the same amount of anthocyanins per se. So there's just variability stacked on variability. And then when you start to add, like, we eat foods in combinations with parts that interact with each other to form entire dietary patterns, you can randomize, people to a Mediterranean diet in America, or you can randomize them to a Mediterranean diet in Spain, and you're going to get very different foods, nutrients, and total dietary patterns that people are eating. And so it's a very uncontrolled science in many ways. And there are a lot of folks, and I sort of lean this way, and that we need to have like large domiciled facilities where we can control everything about the diet. If you look back in the history, there's ethical questions with some of these things, but people have done studies on when states used to have mental hospitals, or states used to have like veterans where they were domiciled for long periods of time. Like there was a big LA veteran study that was done where you had control over the diet, and you could start to like actually follow people up to see if they had like reduced heart attacks or things like that. But obviously state funding for all that kind of stuff has gone away, and we don't really have a domiciled way to study a dietary intervention for several years, or even 6 months is really hard to do. And so asking key questions, whether it's you care about diet's impact on the microbiome, or you care about diet's impact on mental health outcomes, or you care about diet's impact on kids' ADHD activity, or you care about just the usual stuff like stroke and heart attack. Our research infrastructure to confidently answer those questions with controlled dietary studies is just like, not only is it bad right now, it's actually gotten worse over time. So if you look in between 2006 and 2014, there was a sort of a rearrangement of what was called the General Clinical Research Center Network in America that was funded since the 50s, where lots of like key experiments were done, kind of studying things about micronutrient deficiencies as cause of anemia, all the way up through how does dietary fat composition influence blood cholesterol. And in like around 2006, there were some changes that started to happen, and that the GCRC network was actually like defunded essentially in 2014. Francis Collins made a lot of enemies in the field of nutrition at the time, but you can find in 2016-ish, these two commentaries, one in the Journal of Clinical Investigation, which is quite a prestigious clinical research journal, and then one in the Journal from the American Diabetes Association that are called eulogies for, one says it's the eulogy for the clinical investigator and the eulogy for the metabolic clinical investigator. And so these happened about 10 years ago. And everything they say about the defunding of the clinical research network, what it was replaced with was an extremely pharma friendly. So basically pharma foot the bill. The GCRC network was very the nursing staff was subsidized, the facility was subsidized. So NIH put up a budget so that investigators could use it and do lots of studies. The new version of that is you have to foot the bill more or less. It's genuinely ended careers. People are not people of my era and research are not going into doing controlled human intervention studies with diet because it's just a career suicide. I say that as somebody who did that and is looking around at watching all the metabolic kitchens disappear. So we have gotten worse over time with our capacity to undertake controlled human intervention studies, and it's really sad because it's at a time when this in the past 10 years, our understanding of genomics, transcriptomics, metabolomics, the microbiome, all these sorts of things we've gotten techniques for, the field of nutrition is just so far behind other fields because we don't have the research infrastructure to start to control the diet and understand how it affects all those levels of physiology and biology. So yeah, I watch what the MAHA movement, I guess, is doing to tie this back in. And I'm you guys don't seem to appreciate the really long history that there is here to why we're in the state that we're in. And if you want solutions for nutrition related problems, you've got to grapple with the fact that we haven't really seriously funded nutrition research in quite a long time.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that I do want to say is, there have been, you kind of, there's been some negative vibes on this podcast, right? But there have been some changes, related to nutrition and public health. Since the post-World War II period. So you're speaking of observational studies. There was actually a big statistical, those people who are into history of statistics know, there's a big statistical brouhaha over the influence of nicotine and smoking, basically smoking on health after World War II. And R.A. Fisher, who was a big smoker himself, got involved in it and was trying to show that the correlations were not robust or not necessarily showing what they showed. But I think 75 years down the line, I think we pretty much agree that there is a connection between smoking and things like arteriosclerosis. Also, there has been, I haven't checked the data recently, but for many, many decades, there was a linear decline in heart disease since the mid-1960s as people, ate less red meat, less saturated fat, focused more on vegetables and stuff like that.
There's a lot of pharmaceutical and preventive. I think there's a lot. You see preventative medicine evolving as its own field, sort of late 1950s, early 1960s, and particularly through the 1980s. There was a lot of fanfare around it, and that's the field. Basically, you go from early 1900s, people are still dying of infectious diseases, and after World War II. As well as the Vietnam War, where you had soldiers that were dying young, and they were doing autopsies and seeing that they had tons of atherosclerosis in their arteries. It was really appreciated that people were dying now of this disease later in life that started really early in life, young, healthy, ostensibly healthy people. And there was a huge hunt to identify all the risk factors for cardiovascular disease. And I we do have some negative vibes, but I would say nutrition as it's only just a couple hundred years old, like most sciences, and we've discovered all the micronutrients. And at least in America, there's still a lot of progress to be made on this globally, and it's just gotten really harmed by USAID's defunding. But we've largely reduced a lot of micronutrient deficiencies. We've had major progress on putting folic acid into the food supply and reducing neural tube defects. You don't have goiters happening anymore from iodine deficiency, and so we have these we've taken out a lot of the simple things. I think the really tough stuff is chronic disease where, it's not, nutrition's not the only cause. Everybody's differentially susceptible. And understanding, how diet affects things that are happening now, but also happening, going to manifest 20 years later. It just, we need a massive invigoration, I think, into having our methods improved, having the research infrastructure to take this stuff really seriously so that we can look back in 50 years and say the same thing I'm saying now about micronutrient deficiencies. Oh, wow, we made so much progress on that. But you've seen the lack of data, there's reasonable data on things like fat and red meat and sodium, but we've also seen political attacks on on the quality of the science, and because the science is not like as ironclad as a double-blind randomized placebo-controlled trial of statins, it's easy to have political actors poke holes into this. So the 2015 dietary guidelines got really taken to task by a journalist and diet book author through connections at the BMJ, and sort of questioned whether the science on saturated fat and what they said about low-carb diets, and ultimately there was questions about sodium at the time that came out of that. And I do think we're in an era where like nutrition science has kind of become a joke to people, where it's like, oh, obviously we know what the government says is wrong, and therefore buy my diet book, my diet plan, my supplement stack, whatever you want to call it. So I am a big, both from knowing the history of nutrition really well and also watching what happens in the current media landscape, think we could instill a lot more confidence in nutrition science by being really transparent in our communication, getting better at the communication, but also just really funding the science super well, because you can poke holes in it a little too easily.
Well, poking. Let's talk about poking a little bit. I want to talk about GLPs a little bit before you explain what they are and what they've done, and everything about them. I will just like admit that. So I honestly, like you probably were a little part of the push, but I was doing calorie restriction for about 3 weeks, lost about 10 pounds, trying to lose my COVID weight. We were having a discussion about this. I've actually been losing weight since the summer, but very slowly. And then I did like calorie restriction, shed the 10. And then right before Christmas, I really, frankly, just got tired of being hungry, and just, I don't want to say that it was difficult, but it was a hassle. So I started GLP, and it's been 2 months, not 2 months, almost 2 months now. And so I lost another 15 pounds actually. So I'm down 25 from where I was December 1st, which was already actually, I think, pretty sure a decline from the summer. But in any case, so the way I'm going to, I have like, moderate side effects, a little bit of nausea. The way I will explain it to anyone out there who has not done it is for me like giving you conscious control over what you eat. Now this means you can undereat and not eat enough, or have like a bad nutritional balance. I think one issue that I do have is I get really thirsty sometimes, and it's because I forgot to drink water, so it's obviously affecting that. In terms of everything else, I've had friends who are on it who've talked about they don't listen to music anymore, they don't want to have sex, or all these other things, right? Other addictive behaviors. I haven't had any of those. I don't think I have. I'm not a particularly, actually, like people have said that they don't want to drink alcohol anymore. For me, it's not actually an issue, because for me, drinking alcohol was always a socially conscious choice that I made to socialize. So during the COVID pandemic, I did not drink alcohol for 9 months because I wasn't socializing, right? So I still drink alcohol, probably a little less, just because I don't know, maybe I'm less thirsty. I drink less water. I have to force myself to drink water. So those are the side effects that I will report for the listeners, so that they know. But tell us about GLPs. Tell us what they do, like mechanistically, and just tell us about where we are. I think it's, GLPs have been around for a little longer because of this treatment of morbid obesity, but there's a lot of people who are not morbid obese like me who are also trying them, because I have a risk for, I was pre-diabetic, my background, my family history, I am at risk for type 2 diabetes. So it wasn't that hard to get, but can you talk about it as a nutritionist?
Yeah. I talk as a dietitian. I still see patients on the side. Work with a preventative cardiologist who prescribes a lot of these, and so I see everything from folks who are seeking intentional weight loss with the help of these drugs, who also want to, they're trying to improve their diet at the same time, or they're managing some of the side effects you talked about. So I see a lot of it in my clinical practice, but I also just follow the research on these things. So GLPs, we call them GLPs, but they're like, really, it's a broader class. You're getting some of these multi-receptor agonist drugs coming out, and they're typically all within a family of proteins we typically call incretins. So you might get called like incretin mimetics. But GLPs have been around for a while, really studied as like why venom from the Gila monster resulted in like a drop in blood glucose levels. And so that sort of led to a interest in them as an anti-diabetic agent. And it was, obviously when we develop drugs on this sort of stuff, around this sort of stuff, they noticed that people were losing weight. But the hormone of GLP-1 in the diet in the blood, we've known about that for quite a while, and people suspected such an existence of a hormone. Is what it does is it's released when you eat things like carbohydrates, and it tells the pancreas to secrete a bit more insulin. So it's sort of this way that the gut is talking. It's secreted by L cells in the gut and the small intestine, and so you have GLP-1 secreted, and then it goes and signals to your endocrine pancreas to secrete a bit more insulin. And so we knew that such a hormone had to likely exist, because when you give an intravenous glucose, the same amount as you give orally, with oral, you get a lot more insulin out of that than you get the intravenous. The intravenous is bypassing that GLP-1 effect or incretin effect. And so there's a long history of this going really far back, but GLP-1 in the body has a really short half-life, just in the order of minutes. And so it gets cleared pretty quickly. There was a first line of drugs that tried to block the enzyme that actually breaks up, that cleaves GLP-1 and gives it that short half-life. And those are the DPP-4 inhibitors. So this axis has been targeted for quite a while in diabetes. But there was a big advancement in studying the agonism of the GLP-1 receptor, circumventing the short half-life of GLP-1 is if you put a fatty acid group onto the compound that allows it to bind to albumin and have a much longer, and probably other carrier proteins. I haven't followed the literature on that quite as much, but it gives a much longer half-life so it can circulate in the body for a while. And what it does is actually binds to receptors within the brain, as the GLP-1 receptors in the brain, and it shuts down appetite center, limits appetite centers, and also reward centers. And so this is a really hot area. And so anything I say now, take it with an asterisk, because there's so much active development on it. But it also slows gastric emptying, which can cause some of the nausea and GI symptoms for folks. But that doesn't seem to be the mechanism. It's not like people are just getting nauseous and not eating. It's actually something that it's doing within the brain to shut down intake. So there's been tons of development in these drugs, sort of improving their pharmacokinetic profiles so that you get better weight loss, also going higher on the doses so you get stronger effects of agonizing the GLP-1 receptor, and then also combining it with other peptides that target other receptors like amylin or another incretin, GIP. And so you'll hear people talk about dual agonists and triagonists, and there's just tons of development in this area. But the early class of these drugs was getting 5-10% weight loss, and then you saw semaglutide, which is the Ozempic or Wegovy, start to get up closer to 15 or so. And the newer classes like tirzepatide are at 20% weight loss. And this is typically over their yearish long studies. And you see big improvements, as you would expect, in every risk factor. And now we're starting to get a lot of the outcome data where people are having improvements in everything from obstructive sleep apnea, kidney disease, cardiovascular disease, even without diabetes, with just that weight loss. And so it's been pretty revolutionary for obesity medicine. I think one thing that's really important, and you kind of were touching on it, it's really hard to lose weight. I think we touched on it before. I mentioned the Look Ahead trial, really intensive interventions that require active, they're not passive, but very active. You daily are fighting to eat fewer calories and lose weight. They achieve marginal 5 to 10% weight loss typically within the first year. And then the moment you take away all the resources and the constant follow-up and group meetings and one-on-one visits with the dietitian, which typically happen after about a year, they pull away the really intensive intervention, you see weight come back. And so there's a lot of both, I think, psychology, the environment, as well as biology that help are sort of driving us to resist weight loss. So you have internal hunger cues, and the brain is really fighting to not lose weight and to return back to the baseline weight. We see that a lot in animal models. And then in humans, you obviously go into the same environment every single day that's full of, highly processed, hyper palatable foods that are just ever present all the time. And there's endless debates about what it is about the foods that are driving intake. But we know that our food environment is obviously permissive to people overeating. And so the GLP-1s really just sort of shut down a bit of those centers of your brain that drive you to eat and drink water. I've had a lot of patients who note that they have less water intake. And then they're reducing reward centers as well that drive some people to eat specific types of food, as well as alcohol. So they're being explored broadly beyond obesity, just broader like neuropsychiatric conditions where targeting these regions of the brain might be beneficial.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard anecdotal stuff about was it gamblers, like people who are compulsive gamblers addicted to gambling also stopped gambling. So I have heard some people say life is I mean, look, in my social I would just like cop to the reality in my social economic circle, like these are ubiquitous even among non-obese people. People are just taking them to control their weight and like live a better lifestyle. I mean, one thing I will say, because I'm in some group chats of other people that are in the GLP-1s that I know, and we report like how I feel. And one of the most conscious things is there's like a little demon in your stomach that is like telling you to just like finish that burger, to just keep eating because it tastes good and it gives you that like feeling. The demon is like just silenced. So it's just very common to like I ordered a burger at a place that I go, a nice burger, it was like a $20 burger, bone marrow burger. It was very delicious. And this is something like I would eat the whole thing for sure. And I got about 75% of the way through and I'm like looking at it and I'm like, well, that tasted good, but I think that's it for now. It's a little thing, but it's like, yeah. And like, I see people doing it and, I have friends who, were considerably more heavier than me. And like their lifestyle changes have been like radical because of this. So, obviously we don't have, the MAHA people are not totally happy with GLP-1.
No, they actually
you know,
call out specifically in this executive order that they want to
yeah.
the side effects of the weight
Yeah.
drug.
The reality is like if they actually like cut access to GLP-1s, that will be a massive problem because anyone who has taken a GLP-1 and it's revolutionized their life, like just will not care. Like they will you know what I'm saying? They'll get it. Just because the outcomes have been just so clear.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say that there's like no risks here. I mean, you're talking about a lot of people who are doing things outside of the context in which they were originally developed and studied within drugs. And so like a lot of people are pursuing aesthetic weight loss, which like not here to judge anybody, but there are risks with that, particularly like, with weight loss. If you're starting off obese, you always lose some lean body mass. But when you start off, very low body fat levels, like a larger percentage of that weight loss is going to be lean mass. It's also going to compromise your bone. And so people are doing things now that, particularly when you're not coupling that with like a good diet that's adequate protein and calcium and these sorts of things. I mean, I don't know how many calories if you are tracking, but I have a lot of patients who are using them in a medically intended way and are eating only about 800 calories a day. And we're like doing what I do in inpatient clinical nutrition, where you're like worried about people not eating enough and thinking about strategies to how do you, in the 800 calories you can eat, how do you make that as nutrient dense as possible? Thinking about supplemental sources of calories and protein that are not that excessively filling or not going to trigger nausea. And so, they definitely open up the door for potential problems and using them not as medically indicated. And there's so much stuff happening that is really outside. I can't even guess at whether it's good or bad, where you have people using like 1/5 of the therapeutic dose and find that helps suppress their appetite and hit all their own personal goals. And we have no idea if this will be, beneficial, harmful. One of the things with these drugs I didn't say is that there's a lot of thinking now that the effects are in part due to the weight loss, but there might be weight independent effects. So the GLP-1 receptor is found in many cells in the body, like in certain immune cells. And we know inflammation can be a driver of a number of diseases. So they're being explored in things like rheumatoid arthritis, and they're being, there's some drugs, weaker versions of them that lower cardiovascular events without causing weight loss. So we really think there's like other mechanisms at play here. But whether these like really low sub-therapeutic doses people are taking are actually causing all the benefits we want to happen and avoiding harms is pretty unclear. So I know the think Austin and LA and some other West Coast places, just the big cities are a medical experiment that's happening right now that we're not even really monitoring or serving
Yeah.
LA. So
Yeah.
people are going to do what they want to do.
Mhm.
And you can get these things, I know, like on compounding sites and different peptide sites that you can find. And who knows what you're even buying there. The companies who make the patented versions are saying that there's been a number of deaths associated with buying these things. And so it is a bit of a wild, wild west. And I don't know that the current administration is going to tighten up the regulations on that. So we're in for it.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I'll say, as we're talking about obesity and all this stuff, it's shocking actually. It's shocking to see how many we're just like, even from my youth to the proportion of obesity, like how much it's increased in America. Like I think some of this might just be aging, but still, it's just shocking to see how many people are obese, not just overweight, but obese. And when I was in DC, I was with like a bunch of young, potential future staffers in the administration, right-wing Republican types, people that were going to be doing things in Doge even. And, we were going to go to an Italian restaurant. We ran into a MAGA rally, just like a regular, MAGA rally. And, the physical types of the two different groups of people here were just radically different, two Americas, so to speak. And, one of the people was like, wait, those are our voters? It's just because, there are people who live in places in these like inner ring suburbs and these like, high status metro areas, like let's say New York, DC, San Francisco, LA, Austin, maybe Dallas would count, but you know what I'm saying? Seattle, and they don't see the health of the average American, let alone the American, say, in Appalachia. And so, there are probably risks with GLPs, but obesity is like it's wrecking our country in like deep ways. The inflammatory effects of the fat and just like all these other things, and it's hard for some people in certain classes to understand it actually.
Yeah, I think there's huge socioeconomic divides here between city and rural areas, and a lot of people who are in cities don't ever go out to rural areas and see kind of what it is. I did my I was on the East Coast and have drifted out to the West Coast as I've done, including a stopover in Texas for a postdoc, and so but I drove that whole way, and so I mean it is wild to see the number of dialysis clinics, the lack of supermarkets. I mean I think a long time people on the left have been arguing for food policy changes and saying like this will help people on the right in these rural forgotten communities that have been very negatively affected by NAFTA economically, and just like the disappearance of good paying jobs, and they haven't been serviced by fresh healthy foods in places. It was kind of wild to stop and get gas and realize that the gas station they had a few bananas and things, and you'd look around on Google Maps to where a supermarket was, and there wasn't one for like hundreds of miles. And so just food access is a major issue. So I think MAHA kind of being more of a right-coded foodie movement makes sense a lot, and people have a reason to be angry. And there's a lot. I'll be very curious to see what MAHA does policy-wise. But the GLP-1 issue, it becomes a huge access issue. Just the cost of them right now is pretty wild. If you can even, there was for years there were shortages of them, and now a lot of the shortages have been fixed for the most part. But buying tirzepatide from like Lilly Direct is like $600 a month, sort of thing, and minimal insurance coverage for it. And so it's tough for folks, especially if you're not coming from a more economically advantaged perspective. And so I don't know, every industry is everybody in the food industry, I think, is worried about the proliferation of Ozempic and these sorts of drugs because it's definitely going to lower folks' intake and their profit lines. And so there'll be a battle, I'm sure, behind the scenes in DC of different industries and their lobbyists all fighting over access to drugs, access to healthy food. I think we're in for a bit of a bloodbath. I'll be very curious to see how MAHA addresses it.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're saying about socioeconomic, like cultural gaps is like really well taken because, we're very, very, say segregated, but we people in the USA, a lot of us, not all of us, like some of us come from one background and, like go to grad school and like change our but we still have our family and friends from back home. So there are people who see both sides, but a lot of people don't, and, I don't know what to like believe. Like I see things in social media about, oh, there's like a lot of America that literally never goes into the produce section. And I just think like, okay, that just sounds like something you say. Like, how can that be? On the other hand, even I had a friend in grad school, and he's still like this. He doesn't eat vegetables. He doesn't like the way they like just like crunch in his mouth. So he takes like a horse pill every day to get all of like his vegetable type micronutrients and his roughage, and that works for him. And so sometimes I just think like, wait a second, if there are people like that I run into, like who else does not like vegetables and what will they do? And I'm just like, well, I mean, you can like survive off processed food. And, I stopped buying most processed, I mean, depending on how you define processed, like, chips, cereals, like these sort of things. I stopped buying those like when I was in undergrad because one of my roommates smoked too much weed and would just like eat it all. So but if I had like unprocessed food that you had to cook, that was just like too much for him to get together to cook and eat all my food. So that's one of the reasons that I tend to eat more whole foods. But like a lot of stuff that I cook is still pretty simple. Like if I cook a steak or some shrimp or make a salad, it's not like complicated, complex like cooking, but I'll do that. But these are just like little things that have affected my life. So when I see like the stuff about how people eat processed food, I don't really believe. I don't have that much experience with it anymore because I think the people that I hang around with, it's part of our cultural norms not to overload on processed food because that's quote trashy.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're getting at is like, and this is, I think, is that you try and problem solve the American food system. It's like when you go out and you see that people, it probably starts in pregnancy. Like there's basic work in humans showing that like what mom eats during pregnancy, those flavor compounds can get into the fetal compartment and the fetus is exposed to it. And like even, it starts to develop taste preferences that early on. And so there's a lot of concern that if you don't expose people to vegetables in the first few years of life and maybe in utero, they don't develop a taste for it. They're not used to these bitter compounds. And you just get used to the sort of fat, salt, sugar, starch sort of diet that we consume. And once people like that kind of stuff, it's like you talk to the ag economists about this sort of stuff, and they're like, we can grow more fruits and vegetables, but that's just going to create a bunch more food waste. It doesn't really lend itself to people eating more per se, because you have to know how to prepare it, cook it. And we live in such a heavy work economy that people are not, you've got two parents in the household who are working full-time jobs and coming home and making nutritious meals when we're now decades of not having home economics education, where people are learning how to cook. There's like, you can just sit here and list all the things that prevent like individuals to have the self-efficacy to make behavior changes. And they go out into an environment where it's like, even the quote unquote healthier options that are out there are still like insanely loaded with sodium because it sort of has a preservative function and probably not the best fat composition and usually not whole grain. And so the things that we tell people to do, if you look at the dietary guidelines, we have been telling people to do the same thing for over 40 years now with modest tweaks. Like, there's been a little bit less of a focus on total fat and more on fat composition or whatever. But it hasn't done anything because I think, and you look in this in most nutrition education sort of intervention studies, the effects are really tiny and wash out over time because we're fighting against a food environment that is really hard to change. And there's massive economic, political, social, cultural barriers to changing that. Ozempic is the first thing I think as a drug. It just sort of puts a stop to the whole getting a reward from the food. That sort of backs up the rest of the negative reinforcement chain there. But I think a lot of the country, I always encourage friends who I live in Berkeley, but outside San Francisco, and people talk about like, oh, I just can't believe people eat or think this way or whatever. I'm like, you should really take a day trip and just go drive across several states in more rural areas. You'll understand why they're bad and disgruntled and just want change, because it's the food environment that's out there. It's really hard to access much that is not at like local gas stations and these sorts of things. And I don't want to like place an elitist emphasis on the Erewhon style, like or gourmet bougie foods, but there's nothing wrong with frozen fruits and vegetables. Like we can get that kind of stuff out there, but we are moving in the direction, I fear, of like people preparing very, very little food at home, and there's not much economic incentive to go buy prepackaged food that is otherwise like quote unquote like healthy, like sort of meeting the dietary guidelines type things. And it's a huge problem that I don't think America has ever gotten the smartest minds, the smartest politicians, all the industry groups in one room and said, you're not leaving until you work out a plan to change this. Maybe MAHA will do that, but right now I think there's a lot of like, well, we'll take the food additives and the food dyes out and that'll fix everything. And it's like, what? No.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think, this is like a bigger conversation that's beyond the purview of this podcast. And I've been thinking about it because, I think it was like, who was it? Was it the Surgeon General? He wrote that book about salt, fat, sugar. Sugar. Oh, yeah, by Michael
Moss.
Michael Moss, salt, sugar, fat, how the food giants hooked us, right? I remember that was like, and this was before GLP, so it was kind of like he was yelling at people. No, there was so he was yelling at people, but like just to like tell them to like eat less tasty food is just like a really hard sell, and so that's a real short-term issue. But it causes these long-term, we don't look the way we look. We don't move in the world appropriately. We have like debilitating diseases. There's all these long-term issues that come from this delicious food. And, what I was thinking recently, there's almost like no upside to, I don't do this because it's not my thing. I don't follow sports. Sports gambling, like the online, like, the new wave of sports gambling, that is basically destroying the lives of many, many young men in this country, like bankrupting them. There's, aside from the fact that like these companies know exactly how to hook them, there's no real benefit besides like short-term hedonic units here. I'm, libertarian insofar as I think people should be free to do what they want to do with their lives. But like looking at this, I think there is a compelling case for coercion to protect people from themselves on this sort of boundary, on this sort of margin, right? So if there was like a food additive that was like, like incredibly just like good in terms of hooking people, I think we need to talk about this because, like it like amps up your brain, but living in a society with other people for years and years and years, it's not a good. It's not something that really works. And so I think we need to have like a bigger philosophical discussion about what's going on here and how we need to set up society so the average person or someone with less impulse control, like I said, like for me, making like weed and sports gambling legal has not had an effect. I don't do weed, but apparently from what I've heard and seen, there are people where that's all they do now. They work just enough to support their habit, or they live in their mom's basement and like borrow money. I'm just giving other examples where I understand the libertarian case, like let people do what they want to do, but a large number of people will just do nothing and disappear from the world. And are we okay with that?
Oh yeah, I'll make a plug here too for like we would talk about palatability and super tasty food, but when you look into the palatability literature, like tastiness doesn't explain all of the intake effect of what we kind of call these ultra processed foods. And there's a researcher in the intramural program at NIH who I hope still has a job. I don't know. Lots of like we're on the eve of $5,000 like cuts here, but again, we need to study this a whole bunch more because there are many factors about food, and it's not fully clear what's driving the sort of hyperphagia or this excessive intake. But palatability and Kevin Hall, who's the researcher, his newest work, palatability doesn't really like when you match processed and unprocessed foods for palatability, the unprocessed foods still drive intake, but when you match for palatability, it doesn't, the intake effect is still there or modestly tempered. So it's not explaining all of the effect, and things like energy density seem to matter a lot. So just like having more calories per gram of food. And so I think having like a research infrastructure right now, if you want to study what about processed food like is driving intake, these are going to be years long studies to get one done because we have like just a couple active centers where you can actually undertake human nutrition studies. This is where if there are MAHA folks listening, you need to pump tons of research with the sole goal of figuring out what it is about the modern food environment that drives intake, and is it something we can reformulate around, because that would be obviously ideal. The fact that it doesn't look like it's just palatability and just super tasty foods is a really good thing, because it means that it's like we don't have to tell people like just eat bland food. There's a lot of strategies I don't think we have really gone after all that well here. And just to, I guess, sort of round out on my nutrition research, we need to actually fund it. Messaging here, like if you care about this kind of stuff, which I think everyone cares, there is a health impetus, there's an economic impetus. I mean, like obesity, chronic diseases have been breaking our healthcare system for quite a while now and driving up costs. And I don't think anyone thinks that we can just GLP-1 our way out of it entirely. We got to understand how to change the food environment to at least not necessarily like solve the issue of obesity. I think we'll always have some degree of obesity, but to lessen it dramatically. And that's something that like, everybody has their pet hypothesis for what it is. Even the dopamine kind of signaling stuff, there's been data questioning whether like processed foods really are hijacking dopamine. And so I think a lot of what was in Moss's book is like getting at the heart of like foods are engineered to be overconsumed. How to back engineer them and not just say like eat plain boiled lentils with no seasoning. Like that's never going to work for people. So I think a huge challenge for USDA, HHS, et cetera, is can we make foods that are tasty enough that don't hijack everything going on in our body to drive intake, so that we can somehow regulate around that. I always sit and think like, how do we make a metric out of this, of like the likelihood of a food of being overconsumed, and make sure that processed food industries or the food industry in general is not putting out stuff that you just massively overconsume. I think it's like I randomly went to Applebee's for the first time in over a decade because a friend wanted to the other night, and I was just like, it was a bit of a culture shock of seeing like everything on the menu. Each meal was like 1,400 calories. The sodium content alone could kill an elephant. Like, it was just wild. I'm like, we gotta make progress on this from a caloric density standpoint. One of my concerns with MAHA is sort of the fear around food additives is super self-defeating if you're going to try and reduce sodium content of food, which we know is pretty bad for most Americans that have chronic diseases. Sodium has this huge preservative function. If you can't have alternative preservatives for foods, then you're gonna just have more sodium. So I think we need all the tools in our toolkits free of sort of puritanical ethics about whether it's natural or not natural, and really just understand how do we make the populace healthier.
For sure, man. For sure. Well, it was great talking to you. Next time I'm in the Bay, I'm sure we'll sync up, and we'll be hearing more from you, I think, in the near future. Just a hint to listeners that I think Kevin's voice is going to be out there, and it's probably necessary more than ever in the current environment, because we are going through a lot of changes. That's one thing that's for sure. The establishment that we had kind of taken for granted for a generation in terms of food policy, food health, it's undergoing changes. I understand that some people are worried about certain things. I am myself, but there are opportunities in change. And so, I want people to just kind of know where we are with the science right now, where we could go. As a nation, as a people, we have a lot of things we have to work on. As individuals, we have things we have to work on. We just scratched the surface here. This is going to be a national project of all of us together, learning together and making the right choices together. So, I don't want to sound like the end of Jerry Springer, where there's a moral after all the food fights are over. But this is interesting. It's fascinating, and it's important because it's about us. And you don't have to like think about it in terms of, oh, I want to live to like 90 or I want to live forever like Brian Johnson. Like I said, I've lost a little bit of weight, and even in that weight loss, like I move in the world differently. It affects you just in your day-to-day being. And so we should all think about this a little bit more, give a little bit of our precious time to think about what we've put into our bodies, right? It's just very common sense. And thank you for your time, Kevin.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me on.
This podcast for kids.